So, for those that don't know Scott, you've been going to this church for a fair amount of time.
48 years.
A fair amount of time. So I'm going to open up a bit there. I can talk back to people. And outside of church, we get to know a bit about you before we crack on. We know that here you lead worship, and you've been part of this church for a long time, and you're involved in so many different ways and in different shapes and forms. But outside of church, what do you do for a living?
So since I was 19, I've been in sales, and that's been through grocery companies, automatic door companies. Worked for 3M for 14 years. Currently, I work with Velux Windows. But yeah, so at the moment, I visit builders, merchants, building sites, all that kind of stuff.
Nice. So you've been part of River for 40 plus years. How long have you been in Maidenhead for?
I moved to Maidenhead in 1966. That seems like last century. It was. And I only came down, actually, because England had won the World Cup and you needed a Scotsman somewhere in Maidenhead. Yeah, my father was with Mars, and I moved down with my family as a 10-year-old. So left Scotland at that time. And been in Maidenhead, apart from 6 months when I went back to Scotland when I was 16, and 19 months when I was 17 to 19. That sort of period. I've been in Maidenhead ever since. Nice.
We're starting to get a bit of a flavour of you, and a few more questions just before we get into the interview itself. You're a musician. Would you rather play? It's a this or a that. Would you rather play electric or acoustic guitar?
Wow. Acoustics or acoustic electric has been what I've played for years. But I'm quite enjoying playing electric at the moment, so a bit of a mix, really.
Nice. A silly question. If you were a household appliance, what would you be and why?
That is a silly question.
Yeah, I thought so.
Probably some sort of macerator to get rid of all the rubbish that's in my life.
And last question, as a worship leader, I know you've written a book recently about worship. If you had a this or that, would you choose Shine Jesus Shine or How Great Thou Art?
How Great Thou Art, always.
There we go. You know which camp Scott's in there. So yeah, amazing. So we've just got a bit of a flavour of Scott there, just as you before we get into just chatting a bit about the last few years. Really, we're focusing on. And I know that Scott's got a lot of richness and a lot to bring, and we're just going to focus and narrow it down to kind of like COVID onwards sort of like time period, aren't we? So we've titled this interview Running the Race of Life and Overcoming Hurdles, because it kind of like describes a lifelong journey with God. It's an analogy that I pulled back from when Dan, who doesn't actually remember he did a talk way back, I think it must have been like January time, and used the analogy of running the race. He doesn't remember it. Apparently I do. I think I was dreaming maybe. But he's not even here to defend himself. But to bring it into context, Scott, when did your race with God begin? So just briefly sharing a bit about your journey up until a few years ago maybe.
Wow. So I first became a Christian when I was 6 years old. And that was on a seaside mission that my parents were running in a place called Saltcoats in Scotland. And it was a very simple message. The preacher just said, "You've sinned." And I knew I needed to get rid of that. The following years, obviously coming up through school, things drifted very much. I was going to church on Sunday with my parents, and I was swearing and doing all sorts of other stuff at school and living quite a double life until I was about 17. And at that time, God laid his hand on me again, and I recommitted my life. My parents split up at that sort of time, moved off to Scotland for a while, as I said, came back and moved to the Midlands. And when I was 19, I'd been in touch with people in what was the youth group at St Mary's, and I was a good friend of Jeff Wilson's at the time. He's in the Marlow congregation. And I came down for a thing called Capel Bible Week. And that week, whatever we discussed the night before, God said to me off the main stage the next day. And at the end of a week, I just knew that God was saying he wanted me back here for what was the start of River. So that was August 75. The church started in September, started meeting, and I moved in on October the 13th, having found a job, and that was me moving into sales. I left home. I was very young. I was 19, but I was very young mentally. And that was that, really. So that was my journey sort of back into what was River, and through the different sort of versions of, whether it was River Christian Fellowship or Marlow Fellowship or, River Church or whatever. Just sort of been here really since. And, one of the things I know we mentioned the other day, and it's something that does play in my heart from time to time, is someone once prophesied over me that one day I would leave this area or I would leave this church. And I leave that on the back burner because it's not something I'm chasing. But what I do say is God called me here when I was 19 and he hasn't told me to leave yet.
Yes. Well, thanks for sharing that. And that's kind of like, that will provide a bit of context to the next question, much more about what we are discussing this morning. Can you tell us a bit about what happened with your relationship with God back in 2020?
Yeah. I want to say just before I start, really, that I'm so appreciative of God's grace. Like all of us, I'm a very flawed human being. For the people that know me, for people like Sheila, if she wanted to, she could serve my life up on a plate quite cold, because she sees me warts and all. Yeah. She chooses not to. But I went through a period coming out of lockdown where I began to really question my faith. There were a number of contributing parts to that. I'd been reading a book, The Day the Revolution Began, by Tom Wright, for those who've read any of his stuff. And some of the ideas that he proposed were in conflict with the way that I'd been brought up and what I believed, and confused me somewhat. And when we came out of lockdown and the church wanted to get together, of course, there was a lot of fear around. Personally, I wasn't overly concerned, but I knew that there was a lot of fear around. And without being hypercritical, because I know I've mentioned it to you in the past, coming back so early bothered me. Handing microphones around bothered me, because I thought, actually the world outside isn't doing this, and how come we are? And it seemed a bit blasé, and I wasn't prepared to do that, really. But more than that, I'd gone through this period of self-reflection and questioning my faith. Not really that I believed that God exists, because that was always true, but more about the purpose of what we were doing and why I was doing it and why I was leading worship. And I found that at that time I couldn't lead worship. And for about 9 months, I had to stop. I got asked by Marlow as well. I gave them the same answer. But I believe in worship, you can only lead people where you are. I believe in church leadership, you can only lead people where you are. And I was nowhere. So I would have led people nowhere in worship. And so I couldn't do that. It was also church. I didn't come back until the September. I think church came back in July. And one day I woke up with a question, and I couldn't dodge it. It was saying that Jesus went to the synagogue as was his custom. It was probably dodgy teaching. It was probably full of politics. It was probably pretty imperfect. The singer or the cantor was probably singing out of tune. The worship probably wasn't what Jesus was used to in the throne room of heaven. But he made it his custom. I couldn't dodge that. So I came back to church in September that year. But I still wasn't prepared to lead worship. And it wasn't until my daughter Anya shared a song, which you've heard me play a few times since, Be Enthroned on the Praises of 1,000 Generations. Couldn't dodge that either. So that's why I came back to lead worship. But that was kind of what was going on with me at that time.
So through that kind of like period of time, as our analogy goes, you've run the race of life up to a set of hurdles, and you've reached a hurdle of questions and, doubt and conflict in your mind, and also, like you're suggesting, like not wanting to lead worship out of a place of, you're not in that place. You need to lead honestly and hold the integrity. So did you feel leading up to that period that you were prepared for hurdles you could face?
No, because I don't think any of us saw COVID coming. Well, not immediately. It began to dawn on us once things were happening across the world. But still didn't, no one could have predicted what we've gone through. And I suppose in many ways I'd sort of just lived the way I'd always lived in church. I knew that I loved God. I knew that I wanted to worship Him. I knew that church existed, however imperfect it was. And, there'd been times in the past I'd really been quite sceptical. And it was only maybe the home church at the time that held me together and kept me in and kept me in touch. And friendships come and go and all the rest of it. So no, I don't. And it's interesting because at school I was a runner, cross country mainly, but occasionally you get to do the hurdles. And it's important when you're facing a hurdle that you get a good run up at it. And it's important that you jump high enough and that you don't trail a leg. Otherwise, you pretty much face plant on the other side of it. And you need a good takeoff. You need something firm to take off from. So no, I wasn't in that place before any of that happened as a hurdle. And I think for most of it, the thing that I believe is that we kind of live as Christians with faith and with trust. And I'd seen enough in my life through parents split up and getting together again, through my grandfather getting healed, through redundancies, through all sorts of other issues, health scares and whatnot. I'd seen enough of God to know that I trusted Him. But that's different from faith, because we trust what we know, we trust what we've seen, we trust what we've heard, we trust what we know that we know that we know. But faith isn't seen. Faith is the stuff that's unreasonable. It's outrageous at times, what God says He's going to do or what He's going to bring. And that's a different ballgame altogether. And I guess, using the hurdle as an example, that takeoff needs to come from trust. But actually, faith is something completely different. And I remember as a child watching, we used to watch interesting programs. I wouldn't necessarily watch it now, but at the time it was a lot of fun. We used to watch the Royal Horse Show. I used to watch the show jumping. And for most of it, the horses are parading around and racing against the clock and trying to jump over poles or walls or whatever it is. But there was one particular event called the Puissance. And I used to love watching the Puissance because it was always a disaster. Well, not always, but some of the time it was. And the Puissance basically is this massive wall that's probably 8 feet tall, made out of blocks. And there's no way the horse can see over the top of this. It's approaching this thing and it's above its head. And he has to kind of trust that the rider knows what he's doing. But these horses used to take off into fresh air trying to get over this 8-foot wall or however high it was. And of course, some of the times they crashed and burned and the whole wall fell down, and at other times they cleared it. But it strikes me that that's an analogy of faith, is that sometimes we've got to take off knowing what we trust, but not being able to see over the wall. And we sang a song earlier saying, I don't know what's before me, but I know that I can trust your heart.
Yeah.
That's my story.
Yeah. So looking back, you didn't necessarily feel prepared. You didn't have the ground to push off of, to take you over the hurdles of the, your spiritual journey, as well as what life throws us at.
No.
And, I think that's what we're coming back to, isn't it? We're looking at how do we make sure we're taking off from firm ground. So my question to you is, how are you preparing for the next hurdle? You've landed, you've started running again. Who knows what's coming next? How are you preparing your ground ready for the next one?
So recently I've been reading Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools. Not quite finished that, but I'm quite most of the way through that now. Those are quite encouraging books. Those are challenging some of what I do, what I think about. But going back to the doubts over what I was believing with Tom Wright, I just thought, I need to read the Bible. And so, what's that, 2.5 years ago, whenever it was, I started reading it, Genesis 1. And not rushing it, but taking it bit by bit, consistently just reading through. I'm currently up to Deuteronomy 26. It's taken me 2.5 years. And that's not every day, but it's probably 3 or 4 days a week, and has been all of that time. And I think gaining that understanding, taking time to pause, taking time to read, taking time to learn, has stood me in good stead, really. If people think back to maybe some of the things I've shared over time, back from Exodus or Numbers or whatever, you'll know where some of that's come from. But faith is about tomorrow. We need it for today, but it's about what God says in the future. And there are prophecies over my life that I still hold. And I remember, for people that have been in the church a long time, you might remember this guy. I forget his name. I think it was something Wyatt or whatever. But he came with a T-shirt that said Hooperman on it. And he had this story or an analogy of a room, a bit like this room, for instance, maybe lengthways. And down the middle of the room is a veil. And on this side, you can see and you understand. And on that side of the veil, you can't, because that's the unseen. And he said, when a prophecy or when God speaks to you, you're reaching through the veil and grabbing hold of what he's got for you. And you're then praying to pull that into what you can see, to bring that into your life. And if you think about Hebrews 11, it talks about people like Abram and all these sort of people who just consistently trusted God for something that they couldn't see. And actually, Hebrews 11, I think it's about verse 38, 39. It says, all these people died not having received because they're waiting for us to catch up, basically. And then together with us, they'll get the promise. So I believe that, when you're looking to advance, when you're looking to do something different, let's put it in terms of what I see on a daily basis. Someone's building an extension on their house. The first thing you do is you dig foundations. You strengthen the foundations so that it can take what you're going to build on it. And I think if we try and exercise faith, if we try and move on without strengthening our foundations, then we end up building on sand. Not on rock. And it's important that we dig foundations. It's important that we learn and we read and we trust and we pray and we base our life not necessarily on what we think, but on what God has said. Because faith comes by hearing the word of God. And that might be a word of prophecy. It might be a word that God speaks to you individually. But the question is, are we going to hang our hat on that? Are we going to build our future on that? Are we going to build what we're doing in life on what God has said, not necessarily what we think?
Yeah. And these are our own personal foundations. You know, I can't rely on your foundations. No. You can't rely on my foundations because it's my own foundations to stand upon that God's built with me in my life, and it's your own foundations that God's built with you. And as you grow, your foundations strengthen, grow and deepen as you try and build higher and wider, or rather, as God tries to build higher and wider. But a question that goes alongside that: who walks alongside you? During this journey, we can walk alongside each other. We might not necessarily rely on what they know or believe and rely on their foundations, but they can support us for a while. And I know I personally met up with you a few times and had coffee and chatted through things, but I know other people walking with you. How did you find that helpful, and was it something you'd recommend?
It's definitely something I recommend. Family. Sheila, you and Anya. There have been times that things have been said or shared or even pointed out that help. Rob Hayward, many people will know him. Andy Reid. Colin a little bit, and yourself. But when I've been questioning, I've tended to reach out to those guys to say, look, this is what I'm thinking about. What do you think? Give me your perspective on this. Do you think I'm up a creek or not? And actually, when you're pushing ahead, and particularly when you're pushing ahead as individuals, and you mentioned individual status and stuff, it's very easy to get distracted. So over 4 or 5 years, I've been reading books on permaculture and stuff like this, which is all about almost like organic growing and stuff like that. And actually the permaculture magazines are absolutely riddled with new age tosh, basically. But within it, there's stuff that you can learn. Tom Wright, talked about the environment and stuff like that. And it's very easy then to sort of get distracted away from what God is saying. And I think he is saying stuff there. But actually, one of the things that crossed my mind one day was so much of that kind of thinking is about self-sufficiency. And actually, we're not called to be self-sufficient. We're called to be interdependent. And yes, you can grow stuff and share it, but we're actually called to be community. And I think in this part of the world, and I was talking with Gary a week or so back, in this part of the world, we build 6-foot fences around our doors. We almost don't know our neighbours. And actually, what is community? What is Maidenhead community? What is church community? We talk about family, we talk about church community, but the reality is, all through lockdown, nobody phoned me up to say, how you doing? And I'd point 3 fingers back at myself. I didn't phone people really much either. I know of other people who've been quite prominent in the church and nobody phoned them. So I think sometimes we kid ourselves that we're a great family and we're a great community, and actually I think we can do a whole lot better. And I point the finger back at me on that as well. I need to reach out to my friends more. I need to involve them in my life more, because if we're not involved in each other's life, we meet each other on a Sunday or we kind of know each other from a distance.
My final question to wrap this up before we move into our own little personal discussions is, how do you describe your relationship with God now? Now you've been through the last 3 years, or whatever it's been now. How do you describe that?
I was looking back on a journal that I keep, because I tend to, when I'm writing or praying or reading and things like that, I tend to write, not every day, but as I say, probably 4 days a week or something in a journal. And some of that will be just stuff that's going on in life. Some of that will be what God's talking to me about. Some of it will just be maybe a bit of an exploration of what I'm reading. I think persistence is a key. Being determined that that's something I'm going to do. And as I said, I've been encouraged recently by some of the other books. But there's a few verses which have stuck with me for years. One is Psalm 25:21, which just says, "May integrity and uprightness protect me, because my hope is in you." And I've carried that verse for 30 years or more. Another verse is, "What does God require of you? But to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And that's Micah 6:8. But I think the question I have is really summed up more in what it says in Luke 18, verse 8, where it says, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" And my question to me is, will I walk with God? So, persistence, a desire to walk with God through whatever. A desire that one day I'll hear the words, "good and faithful servant."
Amen to that. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your honesty and your openness and sharing this morning. I'm sure we all really appreciate the depths of which you've opened up to us. And it's a journey that we all will face. It's a journey that everyone faces of wrestling with faith, wrestling with where they sit in, with what's going on, big questions of life. And it's something that we want to make sure that we all have secure foundations on, so that when we get hit by life challenges out of the blue, challenges of doubt or faith or unanswered prayers, actually we've got foundations to stand on to jump over hurdles in the faith that we're going to land firmly on the other side, ready to continue running. So thank you so much for what you shared.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Cheers.
Dave, can I have the response questions on the screen? So we're going to turn into little groups, little huddles of 2s, 3s, no more than 4, because otherwise we won't have time to all share and things like that. And we've got a few questions here. You don't need to do them all. Just see what challenges you, see what see what's you want to discuss and share about. So we're looking at what hurdles we might be facing, how you're preparing yourself for the journey ahead with your walk with Christ. And we run this race alongside each other. Who are we personally supporting, and who's around us also supporting us? Who in this community here and outside of this community as well. It's really good to have friends and people to lean on who are outside of this church family. So turn into small groups, discuss. And pray. I think Jonathan will stand back up in a bit and share what's going on. But turn into little groups now. And anyone edge, let's gather over in the corner. I'll come and chat together.